Hello everyone. Tonight, we begin with the languages that died quietly while the world was busy learning English. From words once whispered to rivers that no longer answer. 2 languages erased by missionaries armed with grammar books. 2 entire civilizations whose last verbs are now sitting in museum drawers labeled unidentified. Dialect. Imagine the poetry of a people surviving only as mispronounced street names and half-deciphered prayers. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy falling into historical rabbit holes that smell faintly of dust and existential dread. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Somewhere, it's morning coffee. Somewhere else, it's midnight tea. Either way, we're about to travel back to the moment the world lost its voice. So, dim the lights, let the hum of your room settle. Maybe sip something warm or cold, if you're feeling dramatic, and together, let's listen to what remains of the words carved in wind and ashes. Somewhere, a linguist is crying into their coffee because another language just died. It happens more often than you'd think, roughly 1 every 2 weeks. A whole grammar, gone, poof. Not with a bang, not with fireworks, but with the last whisper of someone who no longer has anyone left to talk to. Imagine the entire internet being deleted overnight, and the only thing surviving is a few post-it notes someone scribbled on in a hurry. That's what language death looks like, except instead of losing memes and bad opinions, humanity loses everything a people ever knew about how to exist in their corner of the world. There's this persistent modern illusion that translation can save everything, that if we just record the words, we've captured the soul. But languages aren't dictionaries, they're ecosystems. They carry humor, grief, sarcasm, gossip, weather predictions, love poems, and instructions on how not to die from the local mushrooms. Lose the tongue, and the knowledge follows quietly, obediently, like a dog that knows the way home, but can't find the door anymore. When people talk about lost civilizations, they usually picture pyramids or broken statues, not syntax. Yet the first thing to crumble isn't the temple, it's the grammar. You can rebuild a wall. You can't reconstruct how someone described the smell of rain unless you still have their words for it. Ancient languages died with their speakers and took entire metaphysical systems down with them. The world used to sound far stranger than it does now. Consider the Yagan language from Tierra del Fuego, once spoken at the bottom of the world by people who could read ocean currents like others read newspaper headlines. Their word, Mamila Panatupa, a look shared by 2 people, each wishing the other would begin something neither wants to start, became famous after the language itself began to fade. Romantic, right? Except now it's mostly used as trivia on internet lists titled untranslatable words, which is another way of saying souvenirs from extinct worlds. Each language, even the tiny ones, spoken by a few dozen people, held entire philosophies. In some Amazonian tongues, time isn't linear, it's directional. The past isn't behind you, it's in front, you can see it. The future is behind you because you can't. Elegant, logical, and almost impossible to express in English without giving someone an existential crisis. When those languages vanish, we lose alternative blueprints for thinking. What's left is a kind of global monoculture, the linguistic equivalent of planting soybeans on every continent and calling it progress. Anthropologists like to say that language is humanity's greatest invention. It's also our most fragile. You can burn a library and rebuild it, but you can't reconstruct a tone of voice once no one remembers what it sounded like. And the irony, because history loves irony, is that most languages die precisely when their speakers start believing another one will give them a better life. Spanish, English, Mandarin, Portuguese, imperial tongues that march in wearing suits, promising education and employment, and leave carrying the ashes of local memory. Still, somewhere deep in a jungle or an island no one can pronounce, a handful of elders continue speaking words the world forgot to value. They don't think of themselves as living museums, they're just talking to each other, the way their ancestors did, in a language that refuses to die quietly. When a language dies, it doesn't go quietly, takes the plumbing of human thought down with it. Every sentence, every idiom, every perfectly timed insult was a small act of engineering built to fit the climate, geography, and collective neuroses of the people who spoke it. When those sounds stop echoing, the world becomes less specific. Sure, the mountains are still there, but you've lost the exact words someone used to describe how their shadows crawl at dusk, and that's not a minor loss. That's the erasure of perception itself. The truth is, languages don't just describe the world, they create it. The Pidanav, the Amazon for instance, have no past tense. They talk only about what's happening. No epic narratives, no tragic nostalgia. You could say they live entirely in the present, which sounds enlightened until you realize they also have no words for numbers. To them, counting stops at a few. Meanwhile, in some Inuit dialects, there are dozens of words for snow. Not because they're obsessed with snow though, fair, but because survival depends on noticing the difference between the kind you can walk on and the kind that will swallow you whole. Each linguistic nuance is a survival manual written in the air. Lose the words, and you lose the manual. In Australia, Aboriginal languages carried astronomical maps, oral GPS systems encoded in songlines that linked sacred sites across the desert. When those tongues disappear, so does the map. The land becomes quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It's the silence of disconnection, of people walking on sacred ground without knowing it used to speak. There's also the medical knowledge tucked inside these dying lexicons. In the Amazon basin, a single community might know hundreds of medicinal plants, each with its own name, preparation, and spirit. Try translating that into Portuguese or English, and it flattens instantly. The words aren't just labels, they carry recipes, taboos, and cosmologies. When elders die without passing them on, humanity loses antidotes it didn't even know it needed. We become pharmacologically illiterate, all because a language wasn't considered useful. And then there's humor, arguably the most delicate casualty of all. Humor doesn't survive translation. It limps across borders and dies of embarrassment. In Nahuatl, the Aztec language, some puns rely on sacred metaphors that combine theology with body parts. Try explaining that to a 21st century translator without getting an awkward silence in return. When a language dies, its jokes die too, and with them goes a civilization's ability to laugh at itself. But maybe the strangest loss is emotional texture. Every tongue builds its own emotional architecture. How to express affection, disgust, reverence, grief. In English, we love pizza and love our parents, which is efficient but emotionally lazy. Ancient Greek had multiple words for different kinds of love. Many indigenous tongues go even further. There are words that describe the warmth of sharing food, or the kind of sadness that feels like rain on a childhood roof. Try saying that in a globalized language, and it comes out sounding like a motivational poster. Languages die quietly, one unrecorded funeral at a time, and the modern world barely notices. We like to think we're moving toward unity, but what we're really moving toward is dullness. One big linguistic beige wall. The planet used to hum in polyphony. Now it's starting to drone in unison. And yet, before the silence fully settles, there are always the stragglers, the last speakers who carry centuries of sound in their lungs, holding off extinction by a single breath. Somewhere, right now, there's a person talking to themselves not because they've lost their mind, but because they've lost everyone who ever understood them. Linguists call them last speakers. Poets might call them ghosts who still have something to say. They live in that unbearable, in between, too modern to belong to their ancestors, too rare to belong anywhere else. Take Boa Sr, the last fluent speaker of Bo, a 65,000-year-old Andamanese language. When she died in 2010, the entire sound of an island's memory died with her. The newspapers said her death marked the loss of the oldest human culture. What they didn't mention was that she spent her final years speaking to no one, surrounded by people who shared her DNA but not her words. Imagine waking up every day and realizing there's no one left who understands what you mean by home. Then there's the story of Marie Smith Jones, the last speaker of Ayark in Alaska. She worked with linguists to record her tongue before she passed. When the final recording session ended, she reportedly sat in silence for a long time, then said, "Now it's all done." It's the kind of quiet that should make the entire planet stop and take a deep breath. Instead, most people were too busy arguing online about grammar in English. For linguists, meeting a last speaker is both holy and horrifying. They arrive with notebooks, recorders, and the unbearable awareness that they're not just documenting a language, they're attending its wake. There's something clinical about it. Tell me how you used to ask for water, as if asking someone to recall the taste of their childhood. Sometimes, the speakers resist. They've seen their language mocked, banned, punished. Why share it now? Others, especially the elderly, seem relieved finally. Someone wants to listen before the world forgets they existed. It's not always as tragic as it sounds, though. There's a certain mischief in the way some last speakers treat linguists, teasing them, inventing words mid-sentence, or refusing to explain what a phrase means. After all, who's going to correct them? When you're the last one, you're also the authority. It's linguistic anarchy at the end of time, and no one can stop you. But behind that humor lies exhaustion. Many of these people lived through forced schooling and assimilation programs where speaking their own language was a punishable offense. The last speakers are often survivors of systems that systematically erased what they loved most. They're the final keepers of languages once whispered through forests, across rivers, and in the smoke of cooking fires, and they know the end has already arrived. When they die, linguists rush to archive the recordings, labeling folders with sterile precision. Speaker, deceased. Language, extinct. The audio files get uploaded to university servers where no one listens to them. Somewhere in the digital ether, voices float, half remembered, half erased, telling stories that no living ear can decode. It's not silence that follows a last speaker's death. It's noise, white, modern, global noise, swallowing the last clear sound of difference. And yet, even this extinction doesn't happen in isolation. It's part of a larger pattern because languages rarely die naturally. They're buried. Languages don't usually die in their sleep. They're murdered, politely, under the banner of progress. Colonization has always been less about swords and more about syllables. You can tell an empire by its verbs. The British civilized, the Spanish converted, the French educated, the Portuguese pacified. And everywhere they went, local languages began to vanish, not because they were forgotten, but because they were forbidden. In North America, children were dragged into residential schools where speaking their native tongue meant having their mouths washed with soap. The motto was "Kill the Indian, save the man," which is a poetic way of saying, erase everything that made you human and we'll call it salvation. Thousands of indigenous languages once hummed across the continent like overlapping songs. Now most survive only as museum exhibits or as sports team mascots, which is a particularly bleak form of preservation. The story repeats itself across the world. In Australia, Aboriginal children were beaten for speaking their mother tongues. In South America, Spanish missionaries banned local languages, calling them the devil's speech. The irony being that these same missionaries then spent decades writing grammars of those devilish tongues to help convert souls more efficiently. Nothing says spiritual conquest quite like inventing a dictionary to replace the one you're destroying. Colonial language wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon dressed as a squallbook. To speak the conqueror's tongue was to survive. To keep your own was to risk starvation or worse. So parents stopped teaching their children, not out of shame, but out of love. The sound of their ancestors became a liability, and the silence that followed was called assimilation. Even after the whips and churches quieted down, bureaucracy took over. Governments introduced official languages, usually one, sometimes two, always European. Paperwork doesn't need soldiers, it only needs pens. Try registering a birth certificate, opening a bank account, or getting medical care in a tongue that isn't recognized by the state. It's like being told your language is invisible, and by extension, so are you. In Africa, colonial borders forced dozens of linguistic groups into single nations. English and French became the neutral glue of governance, while local languages were pushed to the edges, labeled dialects, as if size determined worth. Even today, students in former colonies are often taught to write essays about identity in the very languages that erased theirs. That's not education, that's linguistic taxidermy. But conquest didn't just silence voices, it rewired the way people thought. The colonizer's tongue came with its own metaphysics. European languages divided time, gender, and nature differently, forcing entire civilizations to reimagine themselves through alien grammar. To call a river it instead of she, to describe time as linear rather than cyclical, to replace words for spirit with words for property. These are not neutral translations. They're quiet revolutions in the architecture of thought. And yet, even beneath this avalanche of empire, something stubborn survived. Languages went underground, whispered in kitchens, sung in lullabies, hidden in folktales. The colonizers might have built schools, churches, and prisons, but they never managed to fully colonize the tongue. Because language, for all its fragility, is an expert escape artist. It hides in the wind, in the rhythm of songs, in the accents of those who refuse to speak properly. But not all could hide. Some languages had no script, no secret archive, just sound. And sound, unlike stone, disappears fast. Which is why the next great extinction came not from war, but from silence itself. Some languages don't die completely. They fossilize. They leave behind their ghosts, etched into clay, bone, or bamboo lines and curls that outlast the mouths that shaped them. You can almost hear them if you stare long enough. Those ancient scribbles that look like someone's handwriting from a dream. They're the bodies of languages whose souls slipped away thousands of years ago. Take Linear A, the script of the Minoans, written over 3,500 years ago on Crete. We've deciphered its younger sibling, Linear B, which turned out to be Greek. But Linear A, nothing. It's the archaeological equivalent of finding a hard drive without the password. Dozens of scholars have claimed breakthroughs, only to be defeated by the elegant cruelty of its logic. The tablets themselves survived because fire hardened them during palace fires. Imagine that. Civilization burns down, and the only thing left are your tax receipts, still illegible. The Indus Valley script is another cruel joke of history. Thousands of tiny seals, covered in graceful pictograms, unearthed from one of humanity's oldest urban civilizations. No bilingual Rosetta Stone, no key, just 400-odd symbols, and the eternal question, was it even a language, or just decorative art? The consensus, we don't know, and probably never will, which is academia's polite way of saying, we give up. And then, there's Rongo Rongo from Easter Island, a writing system, carved into wooden tablets that look like someone tried to make cursive hieroglyphs after a long night of staring at the stars. Only a few dozen tablets survived. Most burned or lost during colonial collection. No one can read them. Though the islanders say they once contained chants and genealogies, the memory of a people who measured time by the flight of birds and the patience of stone. These scripts outlived their speakers, not because they were meant to, but because clay and wood are sturdier than human history. Words carved into matter, waiting millennia for an audience that never arrives. Archaeologists photograph them lovingly. Museums light them like relics, and tourists stare through glass, wondering what they say. Meanwhile, the languages themselves, the accents, the rhythm, the humor, gone. Fireproof words, soundless world. The irony, of course, is that civilizations who invented writing to preserve themselves have become immortal only through their illegibility. We remember them precisely because we can't understand them. It's linguistic purgatory, eternal fame for being unreadable. Every once in a while, someone declares that AI might finally decode these mysteries, as if machines could intuit what millennia of silence erased. But language isn't math. It's habit, gossip, tone, sarcasm, the difference between yes and yes. No algorithm can resurrect that. What's left are marks, symbols without breath. And yet, those marks matter. They prove that people once tried to trap air and meaning inside clay, hoping someone, somewhere, might one day hear them again. Because before writing became literature, it was simply desperation made visible, an attempt to stop time with a reed and a wet tablet. But not every civilization bothered carving permanence. Some trusted memory instead. Voices passed mouth to mouth, like smoke that never touched stone. And when those voices stopped, there was nothing left but silence pretending to be wind. Not every civilization trusted stone. Some thought memory was stronger than clay. That truth belonged in breath, not in brick. They built no libraries, left no tablets. Their archives were human. Lungs, tongues, ears. Theirs were the languages that lived and died by repetition, passed down around fires that never stopped crackling. For them, to remember was a sacred act. To speak was to keep the world alive. Across West Africa, griots held the histories of kingdoms in their voices. Lineages, treaties, births, betrayals, all memorized and performed with drums that could mimic the tone and rhythm of speech. The drum could send news faster than any letter, provided you knew how to listen. When European colonizers arrived with paper, the griots just smiled. "We have no books," they said, "because we remember." And they did, until people stopped listening, and the silence became louder than any war. In Polynesia, navigators sailed thousands of kilometers across open ocean guided by songs. The stars, the swell, the color of the water, all encoded in melody. Every verse was a coordinate, every rhythm a map. It wasn't poetry, it was cartography sung aloud. Lose the song, and you lose the road home. That's not metaphor. That's a shipwreck waiting to happen. Even the Aboriginal songlines of Australia, long, winding musical maps connecting sacred sites across the desert, functioned as both prayer and GPS. To sing was to travel. To forget the lyrics was to disappear. Generations held the geography of their ancestors in melody alone. Then came colonization, mission schools, fences. People were told their songs were pagan, their stories superstition, and with that, entire landscapes fell silent. The desert forgot its own directions. Sound, unlike script, doesn't fossilize. You can't dig up a melody. Oral languages are like fire, warm, alive, and always in danger of going out. When a storyteller dies, so does a library. When an elder forgets, a chapter disappears. Anthropologists sometimes record these voices, but playback never captures the heartbeat between words, the pauses, the laughter, the communal chorus that makes oral storytelling more alive than speech itself. Anthropology calls these non-literate societies, which is a bureaucratic way of saying civilizations that refuse to be boring. Their myths were elastic, shaped by memory and mood. No two tellings were identical, because living truth is never static. They understood something literate societies forgot, that the act of remembering matters more than the precision of recall. And yet, this same beauty is why oral civilizations are fragile. When war, disease, or displacement hits, the chain of memory snaps. You can rebuild a burnt library, but not a grandmother's laugh in a story you forgot to record. Somewhere, right now, in a village without electricity, someone is telling a story that has been told for 1,000 years, maybe about the first fire, or a spirit who hides in the rain. The words twist and shimmer in the air, the oldest technology of all. And when the storyteller stops, the story waits in the silence, suspended, hoping to be remembered by morning. But many weren't. Some voices ended too abruptly, not by forgetting, but by extermination. The next great silencing didn't come from time or disinterest, but from catastrophe. Some languages don't fade, they're blitzed off the face of the earth. Epidemics and wars do what centuries of slow forgetting never could. They erase entire soundscapes overnight. One morning a valley hums with laughter, bargaining, gossip. By dusk, silence. Linguists have fancy terms for it: abrupt extinction, population collapse, but really, it's just language getting caught in the crossfire of history. Take Tasmania. Before European arrival, the island spoke at least 10 distinct tongues, each rich with songs, kinship terms, and mythologies mapping the landscape like oral cartography. Within a few decades of British colonization, they were all gone. Disease and massacres didn't just wipe out people, they wiped out the grammar of an entire world. The last fluent speakers died in the 19th century, and what we know now of Tasmanian words comes from fragments in explorers' notebooks, often written phonetically by men who thought sounds like gibberish was a valid linguistic observation. Across the Americas, smallpox, measles, and influenza decimated populations that had never known these diseases. Whole communities vanished, and with them went the only speakers of languages no European even had the chance to record. One Jesuit missionary in Brazil noted, rather cheerfully, that the forest had grown quiet after a fever outbreak, as if silence were a sign of spiritual progress. War added its own vocabulary of loss. In California, Russian, Spanish, and American expansion crushed dozens of tribal nations, each with their own language family. During the so-called Indian Wars, soldiers and settlers not only killed people, but burned their villages and ceremonial objects, items that often contained pictorial writing or mnemonic carvings used to remember songs and prayers. What disease didn't destroy? Conquest finished with bullets and bonfires. Patagonia tells a similar story. The Tehuelches, Canam and Haush languages collapsed under a brutal combination of European diseases and genocidal hunting expeditions in the 19th century. Some of the last speakers were literally displayed in circuses as extinct peoples, a grotesque colonial irony, speaking a language that had already been declared dead. Epidemics and wars didn't just erase languages, they disrupted the social structures that kept them alive. A language isn't a list of words, it's a network of grandmothers, gossip, initiation ceremonies, and jokes that only work if someone's there to roll their eyes at the punchline. Kill enough people, and you don't just thin the herd, you sever the web. And yet, traces linger. Archaeologists find carved shells, painted bark, notched sticks, mnemonic devices from cultures that spoke their memory into existence. But the voices are gone. The context, we can stare at the artifacts, but we'll never know how they sounded in the rain or which syllables carried the most tenderness. Even the land feels quieter after a linguistic extinction. Toponyms remain distorted, anglicized, Latinized, but the music of the original word is lost. What was once a sacred valley becomes a street name on a colonial map. History files the loss under inevitable. But not all traces of extinct tongues are buried under ruins or bones. Some linger in the landscape itself, fossilized in place names, waiting for someone to notice that the hills are still whispering. Even when a language vanishes, the landscape doesn't forget. It keeps the words like fingerprints in the soil, carved into rivers and cliffs, camouflaged as geography. Place names are the world's most discreet archivists, the stubborn syllables that refuse to die, even when the people who coined them are long gone. Take Mississippi, which rolls off the modern tongue like a single idea but was once Mississippi, Great River in Ojibwe or Manhattan. From the Muncie Lenape, Mannahatta, the island of many hills, which now boasts only rises. Every tourist snapping photos in Times Square is standing inside a mispronounced ghost. An Amazon, that lush word on every eco-conscious coffee label, began as Amazonia, a Portuguese misunderstanding of a misheard indigenous term. Colonizers never could resist renaming what already had a name. In New Zealand, Mbori names still cling to the hills like Ivy, Iraqi, Wakaton, Taranaki, each a miniature story about a god, a storm, a loss. English settlers struggled to pronounce them, turned some into half-words, others into jokes. Yet the original sounds persisted, resilient as lichen. To erase a name completely, after all, you'd have to bulldoze the mountain. And the British, for all their enthusiasm, didn't bring enough shovels. In Australia, Aboriginal names are the bones of the continent. They describe the land as living memory, where water hides after drought, where spirits walk, where ancestors once turned into trees. When English took over, bureaucrats simplified everything into Lake George and Mount Stewart, as if the world were an Excel spreadsheet. Still, if you listen closely, the old names hum underneath, like an old melody leaking through static. The pattern repeats everywhere empire planted its flags. Africa's colonial maps overwrote thousands of local names that encoded ecosystems, rivers renamed for generals, mountains for monarchs. In doing so, colonizers deleted the indigenous knowledge baked into the toponyms, the words that said "don't drink here," or "this floodplain feeds hippos, not humans." It's easy to romanticize lost languages until you realize they were also the original Google Maps, except with better data and fewer ads. Even Europe, the supposed cradle of civilized tongues, hides its own linguistic fossils. The Alps, the Pyrenees, the Danube, all bear traces of vanished pre-Indo-European languages, the echoes of people so ancient we don't even know what they called themselves. The place names remain, stripped of meaning, like beautiful ruins everyone photographs but no one understands. The funny thing about language is that it's terrible at dying cleanly. It leaves stains. It lingers in loanwords, in accents, in the way a local says the name of their town with a sound outsiders can never quite copy. The land itself becomes the last fluent speaker. Linguists call this toponymic survivorship. Poets just call it haunting. Because even if no one remembers what Machu Picchu or Teotihuacan literally meant, the syllables still carry the weight of centuries. Say them out loud, and you can almost feel the breath of the people who named them. The stones don't translate, but they remember. And yet, human stubbornness isn't limited to destruction. For every ruin, there's a reconstruction. For every vanished word, someone tries to piece together the grammar from scraps and echoes, hoping to make the dead speak again. If extinction is inevitable, then resurrection is our favorite delusion. Linguists have turned necromancy into a science, summoning dead languages from dusty word lists and have remembered grammar notes. It's a noble kind of madness, really. Men and women hunched over comparative tables, muttering sound shifts like spells, trying to make ghosts talk again. Reconstructing a lost language is equal parts archaeology and poetry. You can't dig up pronunciation or intonation, only traces like footprints in soft clay. Scholars use what's called the comparative method, line up related words from sister languages and reverse engineer their ancestor. It's basically linguistic time travel, done with headaches and coffee. Take Proto-Indo-European, the hypothetical mother tongue of everything from Sanskrit to English. No one's ever heard it. But linguists have rebuilt thousands of its words: MHR, turf for mother, PHR for father, WDR for water. It sounds like something an orc would shout, but these are the phonetic fossils of what we now call civilization. From this ghost tongue came Latin, Greek, Persian, and the entire mess of European languages that still can't agree on how to pronounce schedule. Elsewhere, in the Pacific, scholars have revived Proto-Austronesian, the root language of Polynesia, Madagascar, and Southeast Asia. Imagine trying to reconstruct a language that once stretched halfway around the planet, using nothing but scattered shards of vocabulary. It's linguistic island hopping across time. Sometimes, the clues come not from writing, but from what other people said about the language. Spanish priests scribbled Nahuatl vocabulary in their confession manuals. British administrators noted native words they couldn't pronounce. Those scraps, riddled with colonial misspellings, are now the raw material of revival. Whole lexicons reborn from the footnotes of empire. Technology, of course, has turned this once arcane art into something resembling science fiction. Databases cross-reference thousands of endangered tongues. AI models predict lost sounds. Phonetic reconstructions get rendered as audio. Synthetic ghosts whispering what hasn't been heard for millennia. A computer pronouncing Hittite is equal parts eerie and exhilarating, like Siri channeling the Bronze Age. But revival isn't always an academic exercise. Sometimes it's an act of defiance. Communities are relearning ancestral languages from the scrap scholars once treated as curiosities. In Hawaii, children now grow up speaking a language the US government once banned in schools. In Wales, Welsh road signs appear again, confusing English tourists in the best possible way. The dead, it seems, don't stay buried when people miss them enough. Still, even in success, something is always missing: the jokes, the gossip, the tonal music of casual speech. Reconstruction gives us the skeleton. It never resurrects the soul. You can diagram a verb, but you can't reanimate the laughter that once shaped its rhythm. The linguists know this, of course. They resurrect anyway, because for every language reborn, even imperfectly, there's a small rebellion against oblivion. And yet, even as we dig words from the ruins, we rely on the same archives built by the very people who buried them: colonial grammars, missionary dictionaries, reports written by men who believed salvation required translation. Which means the next chapter of resurrection starts in the least holy of places, the archives of empire. Most of what we know about extinct languages comes from the same people who helped extinguish them. The colonial archive, that polite graveyard of other people's voices, is where entire civilizations now exist, in quotation marks. The priests, explorers, and administrators who collected these words weren't documenting for posterity. They were inventorying souls. Missionaries were particularly diligent. They arrived with crucifixes, notebooks, and the confidence of men who believed God spoke exclusively in Latin. Take the Jesuits in South America. While they were busy condemning Tupi and Guarani as barbaric, they were also compiling dictionaries and grammar guides to better convert the speakers. In their hands, language became a moral ledger, nouns classified as pure, verbs as sinful. It's hard to think of a more poetic cruelty than banning a language on Sunday and analyzing its syntax on Monday. The same pattern unfolded everywhere empire spread. British officers in India catalogued hundreds of dialects, turning linguistic diversity into an administrative spreadsheet. Spanish friars in Mesoamerica translated Aztec hymns, cutting out the inconvenient parts about blood and stars. Even Captain Cook's crew jotted down Polynesian phrases, mostly to avoid getting speared, but also because they recognized dimly that words were power. Every colonial encounter came with a glossary, the weaponized souvenir of understanding. Of course, these records came filtered through layers of misunderstanding. Indigenous tones were flattened, nasal sounds misheard, sacred metaphors rendered as gibberish. When Maya glyphs were finally deciphered in the 20th century, scholars discovered that the early Spanish friars who'd copied them had mistaken verbs for nouns and insults for divine titles. Half the sacred texts of the Americas turned out to be mistranslations of the colonizers' handwriting. Even when well-intentioned, the recorders couldn't help themselves. They framed foreign grammars through European logic, as if all human speech aspired to look like Latin declensions. Languages that didn't fit the mold were labeled primitive, which is historian speak, for too sophisticated for us to understand. And yet, those same documents, flawed as they are, became the only surviving evidence of tongues annihilated by the same empire that documented them. In dusty archives across Europe, you can still find these papers, grammars bound in calfskin, vocabularies annotated with ink smudges, words rewritten by men who never realized they were embalming the very thing they were dissecting. A priest's notebook in Seville might contain the last verb ever written in a language of the Amazon. A museum in Berlin might own a bark scroll whose carvings no one can read anymore, labeled artifact, but really, obituary. Today, linguists and descendant communities raid these archives like grave robbers, trying to reverse the damage. They transcribe, digitize, decode, transforming old sins into data. It's an uneasy alliance between memory and colonial bureaucracy, the voices of the conquered, mediated by the handwriting of the conqueror. But even this imperfect resurrection has limits. A dead language written by its enemies is still a hostage. Which is why, eventually, some communities stopped begging the past to return and started building new tools to speak it again, inventing scripts, alphabets, and systems from scratch, as if to say, fine, we'll write our survival ourselves. Some languages never had a written form until their speakers decided that if the world wouldn't preserve them, they'd do it themselves. Writing was once the colonizer's trick, the bureaucratic spell that turned speech into law. But in the right hands, it became rebellion, a way to trap vanishing air inside symbols before it dissolved completely. Take Sequoia, an unlettered blacksmith from early 19th century Cherokee territory. No schooling, no Latin, no missionary assistance, just the stubborn belief that his people deserved a written system of their own. Over 12 years, he built the Cherokee syllabary from scratch, designing characters for every syllable in the language. Within a decade, the Cherokee Nation had one of the highest literacy rates in North America, higher, in fact, than that of many of the white settlers who'd mocked them. The US government responded, predictably, by forcing them on the Trail of Tears. Yet the script survived, because alphabets, unlike people, don't need water to walk. Africa has its own defiant scribes. In 1949, Solomana Conte created NKO, a script for the Monde languages of West Africa, after growing tired of hearing that African tongues were too primitive for writing. The script spread across borders faster than colonial approval could catch it. To write in Uncio was to declare linguistic independence, an elegant act of resistance disguised as penmanship. Further east, in the Horn of Africa, the Ge'ez script, one of the world's oldest kept Ethiopian languages, literate and uncolonized through millennia of empire. And in the 20th century, a similar spirit led to modern inventions like the Vai syllabary in Liberia or the Adlam alphabet for Fulani. They weren't academic experiments, they were self-defense. When the world insists your language is an oral relic, creating a script is the cultural equivalent of inventing armor. For indigenous communities in the Americas, the story turned even more poetic. Revitalization programs began inventing orthographies for languages that had never touched paper. Missionary alphabets were stripped of their pious aftertaste. New ones were built around modern sounds and rhythm. In the Andes, Quechua was re-standardized with letters that finally fit its throat. In Chile, Mapudungun gained diacritics that make it sound less like Spanish and more like itself again. Writing, in these cases, wasn't preservation, it was resurrection with ink. And because rebellion loves irony, digital technology became its unexpected ally. Fonts for endangered scripts now circulate online. Keyboards for minority alphabets can be downloaded in seconds. What was once unwritable now types itself into existence. A teenage TikTok user can text in Cherokee or NCO, while the ghost of some colonial linguist rolls in his grave, muttering about proper orthography. Still, writing doesn't always guarantee survival. Once the novelty fades, the struggle shifts to usage, to teaching, printing, tweeting. A language can have its own alphabet and still starve from neglect. But even so, every new script is a kind of revenge against oblivion, a reminder that letters are only tools, and tools, unlike empires, can be repurposed. And as the written forms multiply, another evolution begins, one that merges science, technology, and memory into a single pursuit. resurrecting not just how lost languages looked, but how they sounded. Once upon a time, linguists carried notebooks and microphones into jungles. Now they carry hard drives and machine learning models. The work hasn't changed, only the tools. The new frontier of language preservation isn't dusty archives or missionary notebooks, but databases, spectrograms, and code. We've entered the age of digital necromancy, resurrecting voices not from fossils, but from waveforms. Across the world, thousands of recordings sit in universities and libraries, wax cylinders, reel-to-reel tapes, scratched cassettes, some captured languages that no living person can pronounce anymore. For decades, they gathered dust, labeled in handwriting that said things like unidentified dialect, female speaker, 1932. Now, technology is peeling back the static. Artificial intelligence can separate background noise from voice, clean distortions, even model pronunciation patterns from a few surviving samples. In other words, the machines are learning to listen better than we ever did. Projects like ILAR Endangered Languages Archive in London or DORICO, the Spoken Language Corpora in Germany, are creating vast online libraries where thousands of hours of speech are digitized, annotated, and made accessible to descendants and researchers. It's oddly moving to hear a 90-year-old recording of a nearly extinct tongue through a modern interface like Ghosts remastered in HD. Even the fieldwork has changed. Linguists in Papua New Guinea, for example, a country with more than 800 languages, now use solar-powered tablets to record conversations and songs in situ. Communities receive copies instantly, bypassing the colonial cycle of extraction. Suddenly, the documentation belongs to the speakers again, not the museum. A quiet revolution in data ownership, hidden inside a USB stick. And then there's AI reconstruction. Researchers feed computers recordings of related languages, and the algorithms predict how extinct ones might have sounded. It's imperfect, of course, a kind of linguistic deepfake. But when you hear a machine pronounce a word last spoken 500 years ago, something primal stirs. It's as close as science gets to seance. Social media, too, has become an unlikely temple of revival. TikTok influencers teaching Ojibwe phrases, YouTube channels in Innu or Kalaalleq, podcasts recorded in endangered Celtic dialects. For the first time in centuries, dying languages are gaining followers. The algorithms that once flattened culture into English are now, occasionally, helping reverse the trend. UNESCO declared 2022 to 2032 the decade of indigenous languages, which sounds like a bureaucratic calendar entry until you realize it funds satellite internet for remote communities to record their own elders. A whole generation is growing up bilingual in two worlds, one physical, one digital, both fragile, both real. But here's the twist. While machines are preserving extinct languages, humans are still letting living ones die. Funding expires, projects get shelved, and some communities can't afford data storage. In the end, even digital memory needs maintenance, and memory, as history keeps proving, is our least reliable talent. Still, every preserved syllable, every uploaded lullaby, is a tiny rebellion against silence. Because if conquest erased languages, maybe Wi-Fi can resurrect them. And amid this technological afterlife, some tongues have gone beyond survival. They've begun to thrive again, not as museum exhibits, but as living, breathing voices, returning to daily life. Some languages simply refused to stay dead. They were buried under empire, banned by law, mocked in classrooms, and yet, like weeds through concrete, they found their way back into daylight. Revival is supposed to be impossible, but language, it seems, never got the memo. The most famous resurrection story belongs to Hebrew. For 2,000 years, it survived only in prayer and scripture, a language of the temple, not the street. Then, in the late 19th century, a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda decided that divine nostalgia wasn't enough. He started speaking Hebrew at home, raised his son in it, and bullied an entire community into doing the same. Today, that dead tongue is the official language of a modern state. It's the only known example of a language resurrected from liturgy into everyday life. A miracle, depending on your definition of divine intervention, or just sheer linguistic stubbornness. In New Zealand, Mbori followed a different path. Not revival from silence, but from near erasure. By the 1980s, fewer than 5% of Mbori children could speak their ancestral tongue. So communities built Kahonga Rio, language, nests, preschool programs where toddlers were immersed entirely in Imbori. Within a generation, the language moved from endangered to reborn, spoken in schools, politics, and pop songs. You can now hear teenagers saying kia ora instead of hello, a tiny phrase that once terrified colonizers, now trending on TikTok. Hawaiian pulled off a similar comeback. After being outlawed in schools for nearly a century, it returned through immersion programs and state recognition. By the 2000s, Hawaiian radio stations were broadcasting in a tongue that had once been punished with soap and silence. When a language reclaims the airwaves, that's not nostalgia, that's justice. Welsh, too, clawed its way out of linguistic extinction. Once mocked as the language of the backward, it's now taught in every school in Wales, plastered on road signs, and aggressively proud. Try driving through Gwynedd without accidentally learning a few consonants you didn't know existed. Every Croeso welcome is a quiet act of defiance against centuries of anglicization. Even smaller languages are staging comebacks through sheer willpower. In Canada, the Wampanoag Nation resurrected their ancestral tongue from missionary Bibles and colonial word lists. After more than a century of silence, the first new fluent speaker, Jessie Littledoe Baird, raised her daughter in it. Imagine teaching a baby to speak in a language no one's heard for 5 generations. It's less revival, more reincarnation. What unites these stories isn't nostalgia, but necessity. Languages return when people realize they were never just communication. They were worldviews, moral systems, and self-respect. A language doesn't survive in grammar books. It survives in jokes, lullabies, flirtation, in the casual sentence you don't have to translate. Of course, revival comes with irony. Once marginalized languages now have bureaucracies, hashtags, even official style guides. The rebels have become institutions, but better an over-organized survival than a dignified extinction. Still, for every language that rises, dozens sink quietly. And when that happens, it's not just the words that disappear, it's the emotional weather they carried, the way people once measured time, love, and loss. For those, there are no revivals, only echoes, and sometimes even the echoes fade, leaving behind a silence so deep it becomes a new kind of language, one built not on words, but on absence itself. When the last word of a language fades, silence doesn't rush in all at once, it seeps. It lingers in the pauses between conversations, in the names that no one says correctly anymore, in the awkward smile when someone forgets an old phrase they once knew by heart. Silence isn't empty. It's heavy with all the things that can no longer be said. For many communities, this silence wasn't chosen, it was imposed. A century ago, indigenous children were beaten in residential schools for speaking their mother tongues. Now, their grandchildren sit in language classes trying to relearn what was erased, the same words that once got their ancestors punished. That's not education. That's archaeology of the soul. And even when the vocabulary returns, something untranslatable remains missing. The rhythm, the teasing, the melody that made the language feel like home. Descendants of extinct languages live in a strange linguistic limbo. They inherit stories with holes where words should be. They sing songs phonetically from old recordings, understanding only the emotion, not the grammar. Anthropologists call this partial language reclamation. The people who live it just call it grief. Because language isn't just knowledge, it's memory made audible. To lose it is to forget how your ancestors thought the world worked. Sometimes, the silence turns sacred. Among the Selknam descendants of Tierra del Fuego, there are rituals where no one speaks, not out of reverence, but because they no longer can. The words for those ceremonies are gone. The silence itself has become the ritual. You can't translate that kind of loss. It's both absence and inheritance. A kind of permanent pause that says, we remember what we've forgotten. The emotional fallout isn't limited to history books. Psychologists have found that communities who lose their language often lose something deeper, a sense of collective confidence, belonging, even humor. English or Spanish may fill the gaps, but they don't carry the same warmth. In global tongues, everything feels slightly translated, slightly borrowed, like living in a borrowed house that never quite fits your furniture. And then there's the cruel irony. Global culture celebrates diversity while speaking fewer and fewer languages each year. People post Save the Planet hashtags in the same 3 tongues, while ignoring that linguistic extinction is ecological extinction. The loss of oral maps, seasonal knowledge, medicinal terms. The forests may still stand, but the names of their trees are vanishing faster than the species themselves. Yet silence isn't always defeat. Sometimes it's defiance, a refusal to let the conqueror's tongue have the last word. In some communities, elders choose not to translate their old songs at all. If you want to understand, they say, you'll have to learn. The silence becomes a threshold, the price of entry to a world that refuses to be simplified. Still, for most languages, the silence is permanent. Their speakers are dust, their dictionaries are artifacts, and the best we can do is whisper their names in remembrance. But even then, the earth keeps the resonance. Rivers still murmur syllables, winds still echo vowels. The world hums faintly with extinct phonemes, like a planet that once spoke fluently and now only dreams of it. And perhaps that's the strangest part. Even silence leaves a trace. The air remembers the shapes of words once carved into it, and somewhere in those traces lies the proof that death, in language at least, is rarely final. Because every forgotten sound leaves behind something waiting, a breath, a memory, a spark, for someone bold or foolish enough to try speaking it again. Every language that has ever lived still exists somewhere, just not where we left it. The words dissolve, but their echoes remain stitched into the air, into the gestures of descendants, into the soil that still answers when you call it by its oldest name. A dead language isn't truly dead. It's weathering, carved in wind, written in ashes, waiting for someone to listen closely enough to mistake silence for speech. The earliest humans probably understood this instinctively. They spoke not to record, but to keep the world awake. A word for fire wasn't just a label. It was an agreement with the flame. I name you, and you stay lit. That contract still lingers, though we've largely forgotten the terms. When a language vanishes, the world loses one of its oldest pacts. The hills don't answer quite the same way, and the rain falls in a dialect no one remembers. Anthropologists like to say that language is humanity's greatest invention. They rarely admit it's also our most fragile. Stone monuments survive, syntax doesn't. Yet somehow, fragments keep resurfacing in songs hummed without lyrics, in regional accents that defy erasure, in the shape of a child's mouth trying to pronounce a word her grandparents never got to teach her. Those are the small miracles. When the ashes start whispering, some of the world's oldest languages, Sumerian, Akkadian, Egyptian, live now as echoes in ours. Every mother, star, and king carries syllables older than memory, like fossils disguised as common speech. The modern world keeps borrowing from the ruins, proving that nothing vanishes completely, it just changes disguises. Even global English, that linguistic empire of Wi-Fi and advertising, is a patchwork of ancient ghosts pretending to be modern. And maybe that's the secret comfort. Languages don't die because they were weak. They die because humans do. But the moment one human breathes a forgotten sound again, even clumsily, even wrong, the silence fractures. The word exists once more, if only for a second. It doesn't matter if no one understands it. The act itself is a resurrection. So, yes, the archives crumble, the tapes degrade, and the last speakers fall silent. Yet somewhere, a scholar presses play on a 1912 recording of an extinct tongue and hears laughter in the background, someone making a joke about the anthropologist's hat. The voice cracks, the wax hisses, and suddenly the past is alive again, mocking its own obituary. Because the truth is, words were never meant to be eternal. They were meant to move, to be spoken, misheard, forgotten, and reborn. The human story has always been written in erasable ink. But even erasures leave shadows, and sometimes shadows are enough to read by. So the next time the wind moves through ruins or the ocean repeats the same sound against the shore, remember, that's not noise, that's a memory rehearsing itself. The lost languages aren't gone. They're murmuring through the elements, carved into breath and dust, reminding us that silence speaks just in a tongue we've yet to relearn. Long before anyone thought of carving symbols into clay or chiseling commandments into stone, humanity had already found a more portable archive rhythm. The first libraries weren't built, they were hummed. People remembered the world through repetition, pulse, and tone, because memory is slippery, and rhythm gives it something to hold on to. If you repeat a sound enough times, it stops being a noise and becomes truth. Archaeologists like to romanticize the first writing system, but the real revolution happened around a fire somewhere, when a group of tired hunter-gatherers realized that if you wanted someone to remember the hunting rules, or which berries killed, you had to make it catchy. The first mnemonic device was a beat. The first curriculum, a chant. You can't misplace a song the way you misplace a scroll. At least, not until someone invents TikTok. Even today, our brains show the same bias. Rhythm is memory's cheat code. Neuroscientists can map it. Melody activates both emotional and procedural memory, meaning you don't just remember the words, your body remembers the act of remembering. That's why songs linger even when languages die. It's not sentimentality, it's neurology. Across early societies, rhythm was both record and ritual. African hunter communities used command-response songs to coordinate hunts, every verse a different instruction, every pause an order to move. In the Arctic, Inuit families encoded genealogies in throat songs. Each low vibration traced a lineage back through ice and time. And in the Amazon, the Dasana people sang the geography of rivers. Every bend and waterfall carried a melodic phrase, turning the forest into a kind of living score. To forget the tune meant to get lost, which is probably the most poetic form of death imaginable. Anthropologists have found the same pattern everywhere. When humans needed to remember something important, gods, floods, debts, crops, betrayals, they wrapped it in melody. Melody doesn't just travel farther than words, it travels better. It sneaks past boredom. It doesn't need ink. It infects. The difference between religion and gossip, at some point in human prehistory, was probably just the addition of percussion. There's an irony here that evolution never gets tired of. The same rhythmic instincts that helped our ancestors remember migration routes now make us hum commercial jingles against our will. Somewhere, a Paleolithic mother sang instructions about not eating poisonous roots. And 40,000 years later, her descendants are involuntarily reciting toothpaste slogans. Memory is loyal. It just doesn't discriminate. But those first rhythms weren't entertainment, they were infrastructure. Songs kept societies from fracturing. They turned memory into something communal, something that had to be shared aloud to stay alive. The fire circle was the first hard drive, and laughter and rhythm were the backup system. The words could change, the pulse could not. And once rhythm became reliable, melody began to decorate it. Melody could stretch, emphasize, manipulate emotion. It didn't just store data, it made people feel the memory. The hunters started adding verses about courage. The healers inserted omens between the recipes, and the mothers, as always, made sure the children remembered everything through lullabies that sounded like comfort but were actually survival manuals in disguise. Those lullabies would later evolve into chants, and the chants into stories, the next great invention of collective memory. Because once people mastered rhythm, they realized the mind could store even more if you added narrative. Somewhere between the grunt and the hymn, the human brain realized it could cheat time. Melody wasn't just pleasant, it was functional. Long before scrolls or syllabaries, music was our neurological filing system, a form of data compression invented by people who had never seen a data table. To sing something was to ensure it survived. Words alone were fragile. Melody glued them together. Even modern neuroscience admits it. Memory isn't just stored, it's performed. When you sing, your brain recruits multiple regions at once: auditory, motor, emotional, even spatial. Which means a song doesn't just remind you of an event, it makes your body reenact remembering it. That's why people with dementia can forget their children's names but still sing their childhood hymns flawlessly. The melody acts as a neural backdoor, sneaking past the ruins of ordinary memory. It's the same trick early cultures discovered without needing an fMRI machine. The griots of West Africa carried dynasties in melody. One performance could last hours, recounting genealogies, wars, and royal scandals with more accuracy than any royal scribe. The music gave order to chaos. Even tonal changes carried meaning. Flatten a note, and you've changed a lineage. Mistake a rhythm and you might accidentally invent a new branch of history. Among the Navajo, sacred songs encoded entire cosmologies. The precise pitch and rhythm mattered because they mirrored the natural order. Off-key singing wasn't just embarrassing, it was metaphysical vandalism. Polynesian navigators, too, used chants to memorize routes across the Pacific. The songs described the color of the sea, the direction of the swell, the tilt of constellations. You could sail 1,000 miles guided purely by melody. One wrong note, and you were dinner for the sharks. The practicality of all this is almost funny. For us, a song is something you stream while folding laundry. For them, it was the hard drive of existence. Every birth, migration, myth, and lore hid in rhythm and rhyme. Melody didn't just help you remember, it forced you to care. No one forgets the story they sing. And yet, these musical archives weren't just information systems, they were emotional circuits. The same tune that encoded the pattern of the stars might also encode grief. The human brain, ever efficient, decided that memory sticks better when you attach feelings to it. So oral traditions became simultaneously instruction and therapy history, disguised as catharsis. Even today, we catch ourselves using the same evolutionary loophole. Children learn alphabets through jingles. Adults learn revolutions through anthems. We still sing to remember, just with worse lyrics. Somewhere deep down, we never stopped being that species that needed to dance its memories into existence. But as melodies evolved into full performances, the campfire archives turned into something more theatrical. The stories began to grow limbs and faces. The rhythm needed characters. The songs needed scenes. Memory, it turned out, wasn't content to just be recited, it wanted to be performed. Before classrooms, there was firelight. It flickered, crackled, and set the mood for humanity's first university, one without tuition, desks, or grades, where every lecture was delivered barefoot and dramatically overcooked. Around that glow, memory became theater. People didn't study history, they performed it. The fire was the original projector. Shadows danced on cave walls, while someone's uncle reenacted a mammoth hunt with unnecessary enthusiasm. And there, between the laughter and the smoke, knowledge changed shape. Hunting routes, genealogies, flood myths, all retold in rhythm, voice, and gesture. Nobody said once upon a time. They said, watch. Anthropologists still find echoes of it. Among the Yoruba, the Okpala singers turned proverbs into musical performance, part history, part moral philosophy, part roast. In the Arctic, Inuit storytellers punctuate their myths with mimicry, a seal's breath, an ice crack, the sharp inhale before danger. In the Amazon, entire cosmologies unfold through oral storytelling that can last until dawn. A narrative marathon in which memory, myth, and caffeine share equal importance. These weren't just diversions, they were public memory maintenance sessions. Everyone in the circle had a role. The storyteller to tell, the listeners to remember. To forget wasn't simply inattentive, it was treason against the past. The group corrected the teller if a detail slipped, not rudely, but with a certain satisfaction, the same way a modern comment section corrects an error in a documentary. Humanity has always loved being right. And while modern people scroll through screens to feel connected, early humans used narrative rhythm to stitch themselves into their community. The stories weren't separate from life. They were life, dynamic, malleable, alive only when told. A myth could change slightly each night, depending on who was there, who had died, or what bird had sung that morning. History wasn't a fixed text. It was a performance review. In Aboriginal Australia, song and story converged into song lines, melodies that mapped entire continents. Each verse led you to a waterhole, a hill, a sacred site. To sing was to travel. Forgetting a line meant forgetting your way home. Elsewhere, the Lakota recorded winters, the major events of each year, as paintings accompanied by oral recitation. A winter count wasn't an artifact. It was an index of memory, activated only when someone spoke. Even humor had a pedagogical role. The trickster tales of North America or West Africa's Anansi stories didn't just entertain, they taught cunning, irony, and humility. Every culture seemed to agree, wisdom goes down easier if you hide it inside laughter. Somewhere, a storyteller was probably the first human to realize that satire sticks better than sermons. It's odd how modern education forgot this. We now divide knowledge into disciplines, store it in silent pages, and then wonder why nobody remembers anything. Our ancestors had better pedagogy, they just called it gossip with a beat. The firelight performances evolved into traditions of professional memory keepers, the great arts, the shamans, the poets who carried entire civilizations in their heads. They became walking archives, judges, entertainers, and historians rolled into one. Proof that culture doesn't need paper when it has people who refuse to forget. And from those performers, the world inherited a strange idea that memory was not something stored, but something lived, embodied, rehearsed, passed down from one voice to the next. And those voices would soon gain titles, duties, and power, becoming the official custodians of everything humanity refused to lose. Every society eventually realized that remembering too much was exhausting, so they did what humans always do when faced with hard work: they outsourced it. Thus emerged the professional rememberers: griots, bards, shamans, troubadours, seers, genealogists, and that one old woman who knew everyone's secrets and therefore held absolute political power. In most ancient cultures, memory wasn't democratic. It was a specialized craft. Among the Mand peoples of West Africa, griots carried the bloodlines of kings in their throats. They didn't just know the past, they could recite it, down to who stole whose cattle 5 generations ago. They were feared and adored in equal measure, because words, once sung, couldn't be taken back. A griot's praise could make a ruler immortal. His satire could end a dynasty before breakfast. Across the Mediterranean, Homeric bards did something similar, though with fewer cattle and more gods sleeping with relatives. Their recitations weren't written, they were woven live, using stock phrases and rhythmic formulas that turned improvisation into precision. Sing, muse, they said, which was really ancient Greek for please, brain, don't glitch. It worked. The Iliad survived centuries before anyone bothered to write it down. Proof that good meter is more durable than marble. In the Arctic, memory took on a more sacred tone. Shamans of the Chukchi or Iwenki, peoples memorized songs not for kings, but for spirits. Their chants were manuals for crossing between worlds. Each note corresponded to a spirit's temperament. Hit the wrong pitch, and you risked offending something invisible with teeth. Oral archives here weren't libraries, they were maps through the supernatural bureaucracy of the universe. And while men often got the titles, women were usually the better memory keepers. In Celtic societies, female bards passed laments and birth songs that encoded genealogies. Among the Yoruba priestesses of Ifa memorized thousands of divination verses, entire cosmologies stored in melody. Across the Andes, Haraway's poetic songs, sung by Quechua women, preserved oral histories of labor, grief, and resistance long after the Inca Empire fell. The conquerors burned the quipus, but the women kept singing. Paper burns faster than memory. What's remarkable isn't just how these figures remembered, but why they were trusted. To speak in verse or song elevated ordinary information to sacred truth. The griot wasn't simply a performer, he was a historian, lawyer, and moral accountant. The bard didn't just entertain, he maintained social order by reminding the powerful that everyone dies, and that their legacy depends on his willingness to rhyme their name correctly. The storyteller wasn't an artist, she was the immune system of her culture, diagnosing amnesia before it became fatal. In societies without archives, the memory keepers were the archives. They trained apprentices the way blacksmiths trained forges, through repetition, discipline, and a bit of theatrical terror. Some could recall thousands of lines verbatim. Others used rhythm, gesture, or symbolic objects to cue memory: beads, drums, staffs, stones. In Polynesia, each tattoo could represent a story cycle. The body itself became the scroll. And yet, the work carried loneliness. To remember everything is to live partly in the past. The griot outlived the heroes he sang. The bard buried kings. The storyteller watched her own myths become obsolete. Memory, when performed, is both duty and slow heartbreak. Still, they kept singing, because the moment they stopped, the line broke, and civilization, that fragile web of shared recollection, would begin to unravel. But memory has an appetite. Once people realized that rhythm and story could preserve knowledge, they began feeding it everything: myths, laws, conquests, tragedies, until oral tradition became a vast, pulsating network of history, disguised as song. And that's how humanity accidentally invented its first literary genre, the epic. If you think modern databases are complex, try memorizing a national history in verse. Oral epics were humanity's first servers, vast storage systems disguised as entertainment, running on rhythm instead of electricity and redundancy instead of code. The bards who performed them weren't just singers. They were processors with excellent breath control. Every culture that lasted long enough to be interesting invented one. The Greeks had Homer, who turned centuries of war gossip into a single performance that outlived the soldiers. India had the Mahabharata, long enough to make Netflix blush, over 200,000 verses chronicling gods, family feuds, and questionable chariot ethics. In West Africa, the Griots sang Sundiata, the founding saga of Mali, using musical phrasing as punctuation. And the Norse had the poetic Edda, proof that even Vikings needed bedtime stories, preferably ones with axes and apocalypses. What made these epics work wasn't memory alone, but architecture. Oral literature used a formulaic system, repeating epithets, rhythmic cadences, and predictable structures, not because ancient poets lacked imagination, but because human memory has limits. Every rosy-fingered dawn and swift-footed Achilles was a built-in data tag, an oral hyperlink that allowed storytellers to navigate hours of narrative without losing the thread. It's the same cognitive trick as your favorite pop chorus. The repetition isn't laziness, it's survival. Epics used rhythm to compress information, and formula to stabilize it. You could tell a story for 10 hours, forget half your lunch, and still not drop a verse. But oral literature didn't just remember, it reshaped. Each recitation was an update, each generation a software patch. A forgotten line might be replaced, a new hero inserted, a villain rewritten into comic relief. The oral archive evolved with its people. What Western historians later mistook for inconsistency was actually adaptation. In oral societies, truth was less about accuracy and more about usefulness. The past wasn't static. It was edited live for relevance. Even tone carried weight. Among the Serbo-Croatian guslers, a change in melody could signal irony or moral commentary. In Mongolia, the epic singers of the Janga adjusted rhythm to express emotion or divine intervention. Memory wasn't a cold recording. It was performance logic, the art of keeping stories alive by making them breathe. And though empires rose and fell, the epics endured. They outlasted scripts, governments, and sometimes the languages they were sung in. When writing finally arrived, it didn't replace them, it merely froze them, trapping what had once been fluid into paragraphs. Scholars hailed it as preservation. In truth, it was taxidermy. The living epic became a corpse on paper, admired, annotated, and utterly silent. Yet, for centuries, these performances held the world together. They preserved not just myth, but geography, morality, law, genealogy, and cosmology. Every verse was an archive entry, every refrain a security protocol, and behind it all, one pattern remained. Memory was safer when it could be sung. That realization led to something even stranger. If story could hold knowledge, and rhythm could hold story, then perhaps sound itself could hold the shape of the world. And so, in many ancient cultures, melody became map, a way to navigate not just time, but space. There was a time when you could sing your way home. Before maps existed, people used melody as navigation, geography, set to rhythm. The land wasn't something you looked at from above, it was something you moved through in tempo. Every river, hill, and valley had a verse, and to forget the lyrics was to disappear. In Aboriginal Australia, the songlines wove the continent together like invisible highways. Each song traced the footsteps of the ancestral beings who had created the world. To travel from one sacred site to another, you didn't follow signs, you followed melody. The pitch of a note might indicate elevation. A change in rhythm could signal water ahead. It was topography sung aloud. Western explorers, with their compasses and bad manners, called it myth. They didn't realize they were listening to the oldest GPS system on Earth, one powered entirely by memory. The Pacific Islanders had their own version. The Polynesian navigators, or wayfinders, memorized thousands of details through chants that described ocean swells, the migration of birds, and the invisible paths of stars. A skilled navigator could stand barefoot on a canoe, feel the direction of the current through the soles of his feet, and recall the exact verse that matched the sea's rhythm. It wasn't mysticism, it was physics taught through poetry. In the Andes, songs called Harawi did the same for mountains. The Quichua people sang to mark terraces, irrigation channels, and celestial events, encoding agricultural science in melody. To sing a harvest song was to recite a manual of soil, rain, and altitude, equal parts prayer and engineering. Even the Vikings weren't immune to this melodic cartography. Their sagas, half myth and half navigation log, described fjords, bays and coasts in rhythmic step. Forgetting a verse might mean misjudging a coastline, which, in the North Atlantic, was less a mistake and more an obituary. Everywhere, the pattern was the same. Landscape turned into language, and language turned into music. The earth itself was the book, and the human voice its index. The idea of separating geography from culture would have seemed absurd, like separating words from sound. When a river changed course, the song changed with it. The memory was elastic, because the world was, too. Colonial explorers, with their notebooks and flat maps, couldn't understand how people without writing navigated so precisely. They assumed magic, because humility wasn't an available setting in their worldview. Only much later did anthropologists realize that those chants were cognitive marvels, multisensory databases combining sound, emotion, and spatial awareness. To memorize land through song is to carry your country in your head. And maybe that's why oral mapping outlived so many empires. Empires crumble, melodies migrate. When literacy arrived, it tried to flatten the landscape into lines and coordinates. But no written chart can capture the smell of a coastline or the texture of wind. The songs could. They weren't just directions, they were belonging made audible. Yet even the strongest memory needs silence to destroy it. The arrival of colonization, missionary zeal, and literacy-forced schooling didn't just redraw maps, it muted them. The songlines broke, the chants faded, and oral geography became just another casualty of progress. But the silence that followed wasn't natural. It was imposed, the deliberate muting of worlds where memory had once been sung. And that silence, once it took hold, changed more than navigation. It changed how humanity thought about remembering itself. The colonizers didn't just conquer land, they conquered sound. Wherever the map was redrawn, the first casualties were the voices that remembered what the map used to mean. Empires came with flags and priests, but their most devastating weapon was paperwork. Nothing kills a song faster than an official form. Missionaries in Africa, the Americas, and Oceania arrived with two goals: to save souls and to standardize grammar. They called local songs pagan noise and banned traditional storytelling as idleness. The irony, of course, is that while they silenced oral traditions, they also took notes, thousands of pages of native chants, transcribed in Latin alphabets they barely understood. It's hard to decide which is worse, erasure or misquotation. In North America, indigenous children were taken to residential schools where speaking their own language or singing ancestral songs was punished. Teachers forced hymns into their mouths in place of lullabies, and those hymns, however well-meaning, became the white noise of assimilation. In the Pacific, missionaries replaced navigation chants with psalms and told islanders that the stars they'd sung to for millennia were no longer divine but decorative. In Australia, Aboriginal ceremonies were outlawed, and the songlines, those sacred maps of melody, were cut off. Mid-verse, imagine erasing the geography of a people by confiscating their rhythm. Even colonial governments got in on the act. The French banned traditional storytelling in West African schools. The British discouraged oral recitation in India, claiming it was unscientific. Apparently, knowledge only counted if it could be Empires wanted citizens who read, not people who remembered. Reading makes you obedient. Singing makes you unpredictable. Yet the songs didn't vanish completely. They adapted, disguising themselves under colonial noses. Work songs in plantations carried hidden histories. Christian hymns absorbed ancestral harmonies. Lullabies whispered defiance. In Brazil and the Caribbean, African rhythms were smuggled into church music, transforming into samba, calypso, and gospel. In the American South, spirituals that sounded like prayers were actually encrypted maps to freedom. Oral memory simply went underground, humming quietly beneath the hymnals. What the colonizers called progress was really amnesia with good PR. They thought they were modernizing the world, but they were amputating its memory. For centuries, historians looked at non-literate societies and declared them without history, as if history needed ink to exist. The result is a planet that remembers the conqueror's handwriting, but forgets the conquered's melody. By the early 20th century, anthropologists started to panic. They realized that oral traditions, the ones they'd dismissed, were disappearing faster than they could write them down. Expeditions were launched with wax cylinder recorders the size of coffins. They called it salvage ethnography, which sounds heroic until you remember that it was the same civilization doing the salvaging that caused the drowning. Those scratchy recordings, though, became the last lifelines of countless traditions. The hum of an elder's voice, a chant carried by the wind, the faint laughter before the verse, fragments of worlds that refused total silence. Modern researchers digitize them now, preserving the static as if it were sacred. And maybe it is, because behind every hiss and crackle lies a reminder. Memory doesn't die naturally, it's killed, politely, with hymnals and ink. Yet even in ruins, it hums, and that faint hum would soon attract a new kind of listener: scholars, field recordists, and eventually, entire communities determined to make the world hear their ancestors again. By the time the 20th century arrived, the great human orchestra was already missing half its instruments. Languages and songs were vanishing faster than anyone could catalogue them. And for the first time, the world began to panic about silence. Anthropologists packed phonographs the size of wardrobes, lugged them across deserts and jungles, and asked trembling elders to sing into metal horns. The result was a strange collaboration: memory meeting machinery. These early ethnographies weren't heroes exactly, more like archivists in denial. Many were the same people whose nations had erased the songs in the first place. Now they were preserving them, as if recording a dying language could absolve colonial guilt. They called it salvage ethnography, as though culture were a sinking ship, and they, armed with wax cylinders, could bucket the ocean. But even hypocrisy sometimes saves history. Those hiss-filled recordings, however awkwardly made, captured the last breaths of worlds. Take Jesse Walter Fuchs, who in 1890 recorded the Passamaquoddy people of Maine on wax cylinders, the first ethnographic sound recordings in history. His equipment groaned, his notes were condescending, but his archive preserved songs that would otherwise have vanished entirely. Or consider Bela Bartok in Eastern Europe, crouched in muddy villages, transcribing peasant songs in his notebook before fascism or industrialization flattened them out. Each field recorder, in their way, became a kind of reluctant priest, hearing confessions from civilizations on the edge of extinction. By the mid-20th century, technology had turned the field into a spectacle. Alan Lomax wandered across America and the Caribbean, his reel-to-reel capturing everything from prison chants to sea shanties. His recordings didn't just preserve sound, they preserved the rhythm of survival, the way laborers turned exhaustion into syncopation, or farmers sang to make time move faster. Meanwhile, UNESCO's Voices of the World program began stockpiling endangered songs like a global Noah's Ark for memory. Every nation sent samples, as if competing in a melancholy Eurovision. But the real innovation came later, when the microphones were handed to the singers themselves. In the late 20th century, indigenous archivists, African oral historians, and Pacific storytellers began reclaiming the technology once used to extract their culture. The griot, once silenced, returned holding a microphone. Communities from Mali to the Solomon Islands started recording not for outsiders, but for descendants. Tapes passed hand to hand, digitized into flash drives, uploaded onto community archives. Memory became a feedback loop again, no longer filtered through colonial pity. Still, the recordings are eerie. When you play them today, there's a hum, a ghostly static, as if the wax remembers the heat of the singer's breath. Some anthropologists describe listening to them as temporal haunting. It's not nostalgia, it's physics. Sound doesn't die, it decays. Each vibration carved into the cylinder is literally the past made audible. And as these archives grow, the role of the modern griot keeps evolving. The storyteller no longer stands before a crowd, they sit behind a laptop, editing metadata. Their tools are digital, but the mission is the same: to keep silence from winning. Because if memory was once carried by voice, and later by wax, it's now carried by code, a strange resurrection, halfway between ritual and algorithm. But the moment you digitize something, you change its nature. Songs that once required community now fit in a folder. Oral tradition becomes data saved, yes, but slightly embalmed. And that tension between preservation and life defines our age. Still, somewhere out there, in a sound lab or a remote village with solar power, someone is pressing record, ensuring that the next extinction leaves at least an echo. And those echoes, growing louder, are beginning to inspire something new, not just preservation, but revival. After centuries of silence, the world began to hum again. Languages thought extinct started appearing in song lyrics. Old chants crept into hip-hop samples, and the descendants of colonized peoples began to sing back. What once sounded like nostalgia turned out to be rebellion, memory disguised as melody. Revival didn't start in museums. It started in kitchens, in protest marches, in recording studios with bad insulation and too much passion. In New Zealand, Mburi parents built Kahanga Rio language nest, preschools, where children sang ancestral songs instead of nursery rhymes imported from England. Within a generation, an almost dead language became a national anthem again. In Hawaii, families did the same, turning outlawed lullabies into public concerts. Even in Arctic Canada, Inuit musicians began blending throat singing with electronica, proving that a sound doesn't have to stay ancient to stay sacred. Across Africa, griots adapted to where once they carried dynasties, now they carry USB drives. The kora, that ancient harp of memory, plugs into amplifiers and performs for global audiences. But the songs still start the same way, calling the names of ancestors, tuning the strings to history. A tradition survives, not because it refuses change, but because it metabolizes it. Meanwhile, on the streets of Dublin, rappers rhyme in Irish Gaelic, the language the British spent centuries burying under silence. In North America, Lakota and Navajo artists released tracks mixing auto-tune with ceremonial drums. Even the Sami Joik, once forbidden by missionaries, fills concert halls again. Revival looks different everywhere, but the logic is identical. The microphone is inheritance. And not all resurrections are spiritual. Some are blunt acts of resistance. During protests in Chile, Mapuche activists revived old war chants, their rhythm syncopated with the thud of police boots. In Brazil, indigenous collectives turned ancestral myths into viral YouTube animations narrated in endangered tongues. Oral tradition didn't vanish. It just got a Wi-Fi signal. Academia, ever late to the party, calls this re-indigenization of narrative space. But in plain language, it's survival with rhythm. For every lost archive, someone is creating a new one. Sung, spoken, coded. The griot now has a SoundCloud. The shaman has a playlist. The past no longer needs to beg for attention. It streams itself. Of course, revival brings its own contradictions. Once a song becomes a product, authenticity becomes branding. Record labels love the aesthetic of ancient voices, preferably accompanied by a minimalist remix. Sacred chants get looped into spa playlists. Anthropologists call it cultural appropriation. Marketers call it tribal chill. Either way, memory gets monetized. The irony is unbearable, but at least the melodies survive, even if trapped between ads for meditation apps. Still, every revival, however commercial, carries a trace of triumph. Each lyric resurrected, each drumbeat reclaimed, each vowel pronounced correctly for the first time in a century. These are victories, however small. When people sing the words their grandparents were forbidden to speak, it isn't just music, it's revenge, polite, rhythmic revenge. And as the voices grow louder, something strange begins to happen. The songs, once about survival, start reaching backward, calling the dead to join in. Old recordings, static and brittle, merge with new voices and remixes that span centuries. The living and the archived begin to duet. The past, suddenly, sounds alive again, as if it had only been waiting for the next verse. But even this resurgence leads somewhere quieter. Because if songs can survive silence, they can also transform it. When memory grows to full, when words have done all they can, there remains one final form of remembering, not through sound, but through the hush that follows it. Eventually, every song ends, but not quite. The air keeps vibrating long after the final note fades, and that's where memory hides, in the aftersound. Even silence, when you listen closely, is full of echoes. It hums faintly with what used to be sung. The ancients understood this better than we do. They built temples that resonated at specific frequencies, turning prayers into standing waves that never fully disappeared. In some Egyptian sanctuaries, if you whisper inside, the walls whisper back, not metaphorically, but physically. The frequencies of voices from 3,000 years ago still tremble inside the stone. Sound, it turns out, doesn't die. It lingers, like dust made of memory. That's the quiet truth every oral tradition knew instinctively. To speak or sing is to leave a residue of yourself behind. Every breath shaped by language alters the air. Every lullaby, every chant, every myth murmured into darkness deposits a microscopic fossil in the world's atmosphere. We live inside the accumulated weather of our ancestors' voices. Anthropologists rarely say it so poetically. They'll talk about cultural transmission, about acoustic ecology, about sound archives, but what they're really describing is a kind of immortality. Memory, when performed, outlives the performer. When a griot dies, his voice doesn't vanish. It's absorbed first by the students who heard him, then by the walls that did. In the end, the entire world becomes an instrument, still faintly resonating with the stories it once hosted. Modern science, as usual, confirms the obvious too late. Acoustic archaeologists have managed to extract sound from ancient pottery, vibrations accidentally etched into clay by tools thousands of years ago. It's imperfect, eerie, and strangely comforting. Even by accident, we can't help but leave recordings of ourselves. So perhaps the point of all these songs and stories was never just preservation. Maybe it was resonance, to keep vibrating long enough for someone, someday, to tune in again. The griots called it lineage, the shamans called it spirit, the poets called it fame, and physics calls it wave persistence. Different names for the same stubborn refusal to go quietly. When modern musicians sample ancient chants, or when a digitized wax cylinder plays through modern speakers, it's not just an act of homage, it's a return. The air, the lungs, the rhythm, all of it recycled across time. You're hearing the same molecules vibrate in sympathy with their ancestors. Sound doesn't know how to forget. That's why people still gather around campfires, or under concert lights, or in quiet rooms with headphones on, chasing that same vibration. The fire might be electric now, the story's remixed, but the instinct is prehistoric, to keep the world speaking. If only so we don't have to face how silent it might otherwise be. And maybe that's what survival really means, not existing forever, but echoing well. Because in the end, the songs and stories don't preserve memory. They are memories set loose in air, endlessly colliding, quietly rewriting what it means to be human. The last note fades, but the vibration continues, faint, persistent, waiting for someone else to hum along. If you want to understand silence, you have to start in the loudest place imaginable, the prehistoric world. Before cities, before speech, before anyone thought of inventing music, there was already a constant noise, wind scraping against stone, insects buzzing like static, water collapsing into itself. The world was loud, but human life wasn't. Our ancestors spoke sparingly because sound attracted attention, and attention got you eaten. Silence wasn't mystical. It was practical, an early insurance policy against becoming someone else's dinner. Archaeologists have found that early hunters communicated through gestures, whistles, or low clicks, the kind of language you could hear without revealing where it came from. Entire hunts depended on what wasn't said. A misplaced word could scatter the herd or summon something much worse. In that sense, silence was our first survival instinct. Speech, when it finally arrived, was the risky innovation. You can still see remnants of that ancient quiet in indigenous hunting traditions around the world. Sand trackers in southern Africa communicate by glances and hand signs. Inuit hunters on the Arctic ice move through absolute stillness so deep it has a physical texture, the kind that makes even breathing sound like betrayal. In these places, silence isn't emptiness, it's precision. It's what stands between you and the chaos of noise. Anthropologists sometimes call this the acoustic ecology of early humanity, which sounds impressive until you realize it means people were just good at shutting up when they needed to. The silence wasn't about restraint or spirituality yet. That came later. This was the silence of listening, of learning the world through sound instead of words. Early humans could read an environment the way modern people read screens. A crack in a branch, a bird call cut short, the change in the wind, all were sentences written in the grammar of survival. In a way, speech didn't replace silence, it corrupted it. Once words arrived, humans began to trust less in hearing and more in saying. The moment language took over, we stopped listening to the world and started listening to ourselves. Maybe that's when the trouble began, when the planet's conversation was drowned out by our own commentary. Still, the old instinct lingered. Silence remained sacred in certain contexts, the way an artifact of an extinct religion sometimes hides inside a modern one. Even after humans filled the air with words, they continued to return to quiet for clarity, as if remembering that the original sound of understanding wasn't a voice but an absence. But that ancient quiet would soon be repurposed. What began as a survival tactic evolved into something ceremonial. Across civilizations, silence turned from camouflage into reverence, the way one might stop speaking, not out of fear, but out of respect for something larger, older, or invisible. Once humanity stopped using silence to hide, it began using it to worship. What had once protected hunters from predators now protected priests from gods. The quiet that once crouched in the grass was imported into temples, monasteries, and shrines, polished, scented with incense, and renamed reverence. Every early civilization seems to have discovered that silence had a texture sacred enough to impress divinity. The Egyptians used it as protocol. Before entering a temple, priests were required to purify their bodies and their voices. No idle chatter, no laughter, no coughing fits. The walls themselves were carved with hieroglyphs about restraint. He who speaks little lives in peace, which is poetic, though probably written by someone with servants. In Greece, the Pythagoreans practiced what they called ecomythia, a 5-year vow of silence to train the mind toward truth. Their logic was simple: you can't learn while you're talking. And perhaps they were right. Students listened, endured, and eventually spoke only when their words could balance the equation of wisdom. Somewhere in that stillness, philosophy was born, not from lectures, but from pauses between them. Farther east, Buddhist monks perfected the art of saying nothing while meaning everything. In Zen monasteries, silence wasn't a void but an instrument, the space that made thought audible. Monks took vows not to suppress expression but to refine it, to prune language down to what mattered. Entire dialogues happened without sound, a glance, a bow, a shared breath. The goal wasn't muteness, it was understanding beyond noise. In many indigenous cultures, silence wasn't absence either, it was dialogue of a different kind. Among the Lakota, speaking too soon in a council was considered arrogance. True wisdom required waiting until everyone else had spoken, and even then, pausing to listen to what wasn't said. Words were powerful, yes, but silence was power held in reserve. The more someone spoke, the less seriously they were taken. Modern politics could learn a thing or two from that. Even in Mesoamerica, priests of the Aztec temples practiced ceremonial silence before sacrifices. It wasn't piety so much as cosmic etiquette, quieting the human world so the gods could hear themselves think. The Maya believed certain words carried so much force that silence had to be observed before uttering them, as if speech required permission from the universe. Everywhere, silence functioned like a bridge between people and gods, life and death, the seen and unseen. The hush before a funeral, the pause before prayer, the communal breath before the first note of a chant, all gestures acknowledging that not speaking can sometimes say more. The soundlessness wasn't empty, it was full of attention. Of course, the moment something gains spiritual value, someone inevitably uses it for control. Silence, so easily confused with respect, became obedience. Priests demanded it, kings enforced it, empires ritualized it. The sacred pause turned into a political one, less about listening to gods and more about not offending the throne. And just like that, silence, once holy, became hierarchical. What had been reverence turned into regulation. The quiet that once meant respect for the divine began to mean fear of authority. The temple and the courtroom started to sound suspiciously alike. Empires have always been noisy, armies marching, coins clinking, speeches echoing through marble halls, yet they've relied on silence more than sound. Conquerors quickly learned that control doesn't require constant talking, it only requires making sure no one else does. In imperial China, silence became a political art form. The crime of speech, yan zui, allowed emperors to execute anyone whose words displeased them. Poets disappeared for metaphors that bent the wrong way. Courtiers learned to perfect the 1,000-yard stare of respectful quiet, the kind of silence that could save your life, though not your dignity. Even Confucian scholars, who preached moral eloquence, spoke softly when power walked by. In a civilization that revered harmony, silence was the safest note to play. The Aztecs practiced their own version of this political hush. In the moments before a human sacrifice, the entire city fell still. The silence wasn't just ritual, it was statecraft. It reminded everyone that life and sound both belonged to the gods, and by extension, to those who spoke for them. Even the air obeyed hierarchy. Colonialism, centuries later, refined the technique into something bureaucratic. The British Empire didn't only suppress languages, it suppressed the right to speak at all. Indigenous tongues were forbidden in schools. Oral storytellers were dismissed as illiterate, their silence reinterpreted as proof of inferiority. The French, meanwhile, exported la civilization by banning native dialects. One nation, one language, one silence. You could call it linguistic hygiene, or perhaps just cultural muting in a powdered wig. But silence wasn't always submission. Sometimes it was camouflage. Enslaved people in the Americas learned that speech could betray, but silence could protect. They turned quiet into code. Songs sung softly in the fields mapped escape routes. Whispered prayers doubled as rebellion. The colonizers heard music. The enslaved heard strategy. That's the cruel comedy of oppression. The masters never realize the quiet ones are still talking, just in a frequency they can't hear. In courts, silence became performance. The accused who stayed mute looked guilty. The ruler who spoke little seemed wise. Monarchs discovered that silence could inflate power faster than any proclamation. When Louis XIV declared, "I am the state," he didn't need to say it again. The silence that followed did the rest. Everywhere, silence turned into theater, a ritual of hierarchy. In Europe's cathedrals, peasants knelt in wordless awe, while Latin, a language few understood, filled the air above them. Silence from below maintained authority above. The same principle worked in colonial missions, royal courts, and modern parliaments. The louder the ruler, the quieter the ruled. Anthropologists studying power structures call this enforced silence, a delicate euphemism for centuries of collective throat-clearing. But behind every polite hush lies a threat. Speak, and you risk disappearing. It's the quiet that hums between tyranny and obedience. What George Orwell might have called the acoustic version of totalitarianism. Yet even under empires, silence remained slippery. It could betray or protect, oppress or defy. For every courtroom that demanded quiet, there was a monastery that sanctified it, a poet who weaponized it, a village that used it as resistance. Silence was never neutral. It was just untranslatable. And while power learned to orchestrate silence, ordinary people learned to speak with it. Across cultures, the unsaid became an entire language, one of gesture, glance, and pause. It wasn't submission anymore, it was strategy. Silence isn't the absence of language, it's just language stripped down to its bones. The pause, the look, the gesture that finishes a sentence without saying it. Every culture speaks silence fluently, they just use different dialects of it. Anthropologists love to compare these quiet grammars. In Japan, silence can mean respect, embarrassment, or disagreement, depending on how long it lasts. In Finnish conversation, pauses are normal, comfortable gaps in which thought is allowed to breathe. Meanwhile, Americans panic if the air goes wordless for more than 3 seconds, as if silence itself were a social emergency. It's a cultural allergy to quiet, cured only by saying something, anything, even if it's nonsense. In many indigenous societies, silence is not awkward, it's etiquette. Among the Western Apache, people remain quiet when meeting strangers until they've observed enough to speak with intention. It's not shyness, it's diagnostic. Silence, in this sense, is intelligence made visible. In contrast, the Western habit of filling every gap with chatter often sounds, from an anthropological distance, like fear disguised as eloquence. Then there's the silent dialogue of gesture. In rural Madagascar, raised eyebrows can replace entire sentences. In Polynesian meeting houses, a bowed head communicates deference far more precisely than words could. Across nomadic desert cultures, silence and stillness are survival traits, a way of conserving energy and respect simultaneously. To speak too much in the Sahara is to exhaust not only yourself but your audience. Even within one culture, silence shifts its shape. A mother's hush means tenderness. A courtroom's hush means warning. Lovers, monks, mourners, each keeps their own kind of quiet. Linguists call this communicative silence, but that phrase hardly captures its texture. It's more like social breathing, the inhale between expressions, the soft exhale of understanding. Western academia, obsessed with documentation, struggle to catalogue silence. How do you archive what isn't said? Field anthropologists filled notebooks with ellipses. Whole conversations reduced to pause of several minutes, yet those gaps, those invisible exchanges, often carried more weight than any recorded dialogue. A long silence after a question might signal offense, or sorrow, or wisdom, but it always signaled something. Among the Sami of northern Scandinavia, oral poets often began performances with extended silence, eyes closed, feeling for the right rhythm before the joke began. The audience waited, patient, because they understood that words without stillness lose their center. To them, silence wasn't delay, it was alignment. Perhaps that's what the anthropologist Keith Basso meant when he said that silence speaks louder than words. Not in metaphor, but in practice. The unspoken is a form of precision. The more a society values relationship over rhetoric, the more it lets quiet carry the message. But in the march of modernity, that subtlety began to fade. The industrial world redefined silence as inefficiency, dead air that had to be filled with slogans, orders, or advertisements. Cities taught people to fear quiet spaces, the way earlier civilizations feared dark ones. Silence, once considered sacred, now felt like a malfunction. And as the noise grew, the last true sanctuaries of quiet temples, monasteries, caves, deserts, became refuges for the few who still remembered what it was for. Those who sought the divine began to retreat inward, away from the noise of markets and machines, back to the only place where silence could still mean something holy. When sound became ordinary, silence moved into the body. It stopped being a social gesture and turned into a spiritual experiment, a method for tuning the self to something beyond words. Across centuries and continents, those who wanted to find God, enlightenment, or simply peace, all began by closing their mouths. Apparently, transcendence prefers good acoustics. In the deserts of Egypt, early Christian monks took vows of silence not for discipline but for survival of the soul. The desert fathers believed the tongue was a gate to sin, so they sealed it. Their silence wasn't passive, it was warfare against vanity, pride, and the temptation to narrate one's holiness aloud. They slept little, ate less, and tried to prove that salvation was an inside voice. In medieval Europe, monastic orders formalized this philosophy into liturgy. The Benedictines scheduled silence into the day, like a sacrament. The Cistercians went further, banning unnecessary speech entirely. Imagine spending decades in a stone cloister where even a cough felt like heresy. But for them, stillness wasn't emptiness, it was architecture for contemplation. They weren't muting life, they were amplifying the divine. Meanwhile, far to the east, Buddhist monks were engineering their own acoustics of enlightenment. In Zen monasteries, silence was treated as the highest form of teaching. Masters would respond to students' questions with nothing but a stare, or a strike of the staff, or the sound of wind through paper walls. To the uninitiated, it looked like mysticism. To the monks, it was grammar. Silence wasn't absence, it was syntax for the unsayable. And then came yoga, originally not a fitness trend, but a science of restraint. In ancient India, the practice of mauna vow of silence was considered a discipline of energy. Speech wasted life force. Silence condensed it. Sages withdrew into caves, breathing slowly until their pulse matched the heartbeat of the world. They weren't trying to escape sound, but to return to its source, that perfect still point before creation made its first vibration. Among indigenous peoples of North America, the same intuition surfaced differently. Many tribes practiced ritual silence before major decisions or ceremonies, understanding that speech without stillness is just noise. Some healers fasted from both food and words before visions, believing the body needed quiet to hear the earth. Silence, in that sense, wasn't self-denial, it was communion. Anthropologists call this embodied silence, the idea that quiet is a physical state, not a linguistic one. The heart slows, the breath deepens, the body becomes the echo chamber of thought. You don't just keep silence, you become it. And in that transformation, something happens. The edges of the self blur. Many mystics, from Sufi dervishes to Christian anchorites, describe the same experience, a dissolution of boundary, a merging with the infinite, which is beautiful, though difficult to explain without sounding either enlightened or insane. Still, the pattern is clear. Wherever words failed, silence stepped in. It promised direct experience where doctrine offered only description. It became the sacred body's last rebellion against the empire of speech. But the world outside the monasteries and mountains wasn't impressed. Because while the mystics were cultivating inner stillness, the rest of humanity was doing the opposite, building cities, factories, machines, and eventually, an entire civilization powered by permanent noise. And in that industrial roar, silence stopped being holy and started being extinct. The Industrial Revolution did more than reshape economies, it rewired the planet's soundscape. For most of human history, silence had been easy to find. You just walked away. Then came factories, engines, whistles, and clocks, the orchestra of progress, conducted by capital. Within a century, the natural hush that had once surrounded human life was drowned in mechanical rhythm. The Anthropocene didn't begin with pollution or profit. It began when the earth itself lost its ability to pause. Noise became the anthem of civilization. Steam engines shrieked, newspapers shouted, and political revolutions erupted in slogans instead of songs. The first cities to industrialize were so loud that doctors coined new medical terms: neurasthenia, urban fatigue, railway brain. In Victorian London, silence became a luxury item. Only the rich could afford thick walls. In New York, people complained that the city never slept, as if that were progress rather than pathology. Anthropologists looking back on this period call it the colonization of sound, the way industrial society replaced organic rhythms with mechanical ones. The steady hum of wind and river was swapped for the tick of the clock, the hiss of steam, the metallic scream of work. Nature didn't disappear. It was simply outshouted. Colonialism, meanwhile, exported this new sound ideology abroad. Missionaries brought hymns, soldiers brought cannons, and administrators brought bureaucracy, a symphony of power that filled one's quiet landscapes. Indigenous chants were suppressed as noise, local instruments confiscated for being heathen and silent, rituals outlawed because they lacked proper European enthusiasm. Entire continents were taught that noise was modernity and silence was ignorance. In the early 20th century, silence became almost suspicious. Psychiatrists described the silent type as emotionally repressed. Schools punished children for daydreaming. Offices demanded conversation. Even churches grew louder. More organs, more choirs, more microphones. Heaven itself was being amplified. The quiet soul, once saintly, was now maladjusted. By mid-century, the planet hummed. Cars, planes, and radios filled the air with what anthropologist Stephen Feld later called acoustic imperialism, the domination of the human ear by industrial noise. Silence became something you could only buy. Soundproof windows, rural vacations, noise-cancelling headphones. The marketplace had monetized tranquility. Even peace had an invoice. The irony, of course, is that in chasing constant sound, people began to crave its opposite. Writers like John Cage and poets of the Beat generation tried to reclaim silence as art, though Cage had to enclose it in a concert hall to make audiences pay attention. His famous piece, 433, was a kind of revenge on modernity. 4.5 minutes of enforced listening to everything else. The coughs, the shuffling, the air conditioning, the accidental symphony of a world that had forgotten how to be quiet. And yet, beneath all that clamor, a new kind of silence began to form. Not the natural hush of the forest, but the deliberate stillness of resistance. A quiet that didn't mean absence or defeat, but refusal. Because in an age addicted to noise, silence itself began to look like rebellion. At some point, silence stopped meaning obedience and started meaning no. The same stillness that once served kings and gods was reclaimed by those it had oppressed. In the modern era, to stay silent became its own form of protest, a language sharper than slogans, more enduring than applause. You could hear it, or rather, not hear it, in India, where Gandhi held his weekly vow of silence. Every Monday, he refused to speak, using the day to listen, to write, and to remind others that words can also be weapons. His silence unnerved colonial officials more than any speech could have. You can debate a voice. You can't argue with absence. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, civil rights activists stood wordless before segregated lunch counters, their quiet more deafening than any chant. The photos still hum with that paradox: stillness as confrontation, calm as defiance. Silence stripped the oppressor of his script. You can't accuse someone of shouting when they've said nothing at all. In Latin America, mothers of the disappeared gathered in city squares, holding photos of their children and refusing to speak. Their muteness wasn't grief alone, it was accusation. When the state controls every word, silence becomes evidence. Anthropologists later described this as the ritual of witness, a public performance of memory in which sound would have been almost indecent. Even in feminist movements, silence turned inside out. For centuries, women had been told that quiet was their virtue. Then came the reversal. Silence, used as critique, not compliance. In the 1970s, performance artists like Marina Abramovic and Anna Mendieta staged long, wordless acts of endurance, bodies, standing, waiting, staring, forcing audiences to confront what society refused to say aloud. In those performances, the silence wasn't empty, it was accusatory. It had teeth. In South Africa, during apartheid, protesters sometimes observed minutes of silence in the streets, creating what journalists called the sound of ungovernability. Even prisons used it strategically, inmates refusing to answer guards, transforming the absence of noise into collective control. It turns out, silence can be contagious. Anthropologists studying protest now talk about the semiotics of quiet, how muteness can signal dissent when speech is too costly. A vigil, a sit-in, a hunger strike, all are structured around withholding, around the refusal to participate in the expected rhythm of society. In that sense, silence functions like a cultural blackout, cutting the power to the usual conversation so something new can flicker in the dark. But silence doesn't belong only to the righteous. Dictators use it to the censorship kind, not the contemplative kind. Every totalitarian regime builds its own library of unsaid things. The difference is intent. Power uses silence to erase. Resistance uses it to expose. One conceals, the other reveals. Both, however, understand its potency. There's an ancient irony to this. The earliest humans used quiet to survive predators. The modern ones use it to survive politics. The instinct hasn't changed, only the species of danger. Yet the most devastating silence isn't the chosen kind. It's the forced one. Not the pause of protest, but the vacuum left by voices that no longer exist. Languages gone extinct. Songs unsung. Names unremembered. That's the silence that outlasts empires and revolutions alike. The one that creeps in after the last word dies. When a language dies, the world loses more than vocabulary. It loses a way of thinking, a lens, a rhythm, a specific angle of sunlight. Linguists estimate that roughly every 2 weeks, one language vanishes forever. No explosion, no ceremony, just a quiet erasure as the last speaker forgets, or dies, or simply stops being heard. It's extinction by neglect, not violence, though the effect is the same. Each lost tongue takes with it entire libraries of meaning. The word forest doesn't mean the same thing in an Amazonian language as it does in English. In some Tupi-Guarani dialects, there were 20 different verbs for listening, each specifying how one listened, to trees, to wind, to ancestors. Lose the words, and you lose the distinctions. The silence that follows is not empty, it's impoverished. Anthropologists who've documented language loss describe it like attending a slow funeral for thought. The Andamanese languages of the Indian Ocean, once a chorus of island identities, now survive in single speakers. Yagan from Tierra del Fuego ended in 2022 when its last fluent speaker, Cristina Calderon, passed away. When she died, the wind didn't change, but something in human perception did. One less way to describe it. The causes are depressingly predictable. Colonization, forced schooling, migration, globalization, all versions of the same imperial script. The conqueror never kills a people outright. He just teaches them to stop speaking themselves. Children are punished for their mother tongue, and within 2 generations, they inherit only the silence of assimilation. The Australian stolen generations, the residential schools of Canada, the boarding institutions of the United States, all practiced linguistic exorcism with bureaucratic efficiency. And here's the cruelest twist. Languages don't die suddenly. They decay. First, the songs stop being sung. Then the jokes fade. Then the grammar collapses into borrowed words. By the time linguists arrive with their recorders, they're interviewing ghosts. An elder pauses mid-sentence, searching for a word that no longer exists, and the air between them becomes an archaeological site. For linguists, the process of documenting a dying language feels like embalming it. You can record the words, but you can't revive the world that spoke them. Vocabulary is only one part of memory. Syntax carries the world view. Some languages have no word for I. Others classify rivers as animate beings. English, bless its heart, calls all of it property. And then there's the deeper grief, the silence that settles over the community itself. When a language disappears, people often stop telling stories, not because they've forgotten, but because translation feels like betrayal. What's the point of speaking if your words no longer recognize you? In the ruins of lost languages, anthropologists sometimes find new patterns of silence, pauses, gestures, songs without lyrics. Survivors speak through rhythm or dance, creating what scholars call post-verbal communication. It's not that they've run out of words, it's that the available ones no longer fit. And this brings us to a haunting paradox. Sometimes, after everything has been said, silence is all that's left that still feels true. Because once the language dies, silence doesn't just mark the end of speech, it becomes the final dialect of remembrance. Even when languages fade, the world keeps the accent of what was once said. Memory doesn't vanish. It migrates into objects, gestures, and landscapes that remember on our behalf. Anthropologists sometimes call this material memory, though that makes it sound less ghostly than it is. In truth, the silence left by extinct tongues hums faintly through the things that survived them. A clay pot found in a burial site still carries the rhythm of the hand that shaped it, the curve where the potter once exhaled. Patterns woven into Andean textiles encode mythologies in color and symmetry, the fabric functioning like a silent archive. Among the Dogon of Mali, even the arrangement of granaries has grammatical meaning, architecture as syntax. When the words disappear, the designs keep talking. In Aboriginal Australia, songs and stories once mapped the land in precise melodic lines, known as songlines, oral GPS systems that marked every river, rock, and sacred tree. Today, many of those songs are gone, but the landscape still holds their logic. Walk long enough, and you can sense where a melody once turned. The land remembers, even if the voice doesn't. Objects to become reluctant archivists. Polynesian shell ornaments, Arctic amulets carved from bone, Mesoamerican codices written on bark, each one mutters in its own material language. Archaeologists, ever the professional eavesdroppers of history, listen through microscopes and carbon dates, trying to translate a silence that doesn't want to cooperate. Even daily rituals, grinding grain, painting faces, braiding hair, carry echoes of extinct vocabularies. Among the Innu of northern Japan, words once accompanied every gesture, a prayer for fire, a greeting to the river, a farewell to the bear. When Japanese colonization silenced the Ainu tongue, those movements continued wordlessly, as if the body refused to forget what the mouth could no longer say. There's a strange persistence in human memory, the need to keep talking even when the language is gone. You can see it in funeral rites, where songs are replaced by humming, or in migration rituals, where gestures replace storytelling. Silence becomes choreography, memory shifting from sound to motion. It's less about preservation than about stubbornness. And perhaps that's the most haunting part, the realization that silence itself can act as a container for what once was spoken. The ruins of temples still echo hymns no one remembers. Manuscripts are burned, yet their ideas survive in the margins of other civilizations. The Sumerians forgot their gods, but their cuneiform tablets still whisper agricultural gossip. Every civilization leaves behind a residue of unsaid things, fragments too quiet for history, but too loud for oblivion. Archaeologists can unearth them, linguists can transcribe them, but neither can resurrect their voice. What remains is an in-between space, not sound, not absence, but something that feels like listening to time itself exhale. And yet, even as silence accumulates, it begins to feel familiar, almost human. Because if you stay long enough among what's been forgotten, you start to sense that silence isn't the end of memory, it's what memory becomes when it no longer needs to speak. Eventually, silence stopped being the background of history and became its last surviving sentence. After all the prayers, chants, and revolutions, the world circled back to the same quiet it began with, not the strategic kind used for survival or reverence, but a vast, inevitable one that swallowed everything spoken. It's the sound history makes when it exhales. You can trace its beginnings to the 20th century, when war and technology began rewriting the planet's vocabulary faster than anyone could translate it. The nuclear age gave humanity a new dialect, one too dangerous to articulate. Entire generations grew up under the philosophy of better not to say. Silence became the sound of collective anxiety. Even artists and philosophers began to notice that the more we invented ways to communicate, the less we actually said. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein famously ended his Tractatus with the line, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." It wasn't just logical rigor, it was prophecy. As language strained under the weight of modern complexity, silence started to look like the only honest expression left. The poet Paul Celan wrote in the ruins of the Holocaust, turning silence into a form of mourning, every word an apology for the ones that couldn't be written. Anthropologists studying post-war societies observed a pattern. When trauma exceeds vocabulary, people stop talking. Survivors of genocide, famine, slavery, all carry long intervals of quiet, not because they forget, but because remembrance has become unspeakable. In that sense, silence is not amnesia, it's preservation. It keeps pain intact by refusing to translate it. And so the world entered what scholars sometimes call the age of languages continued to vanish, rituals grew rarer. Sound itself was replaced by data. We began recording everything but listening to nothing. Our devices hum louder than our thoughts. Yet beneath the static, an older rhythm still waits. The same hush that once settled over hunters before a kill, monks before a prayer, mourners before a name. It's not peace, it's awareness. The irony, of course, is that in drowning the planet with noise, we've come full circle. We crave quiet again, apps for meditation, rooms designed to absorb sound, algorithms promising serenity. Modern people pay for what our ancestors were born with, the right to hear nothing. Silence has become the new luxury, the final symbol of wealth, wisdom, or surrender, depending on who's selling it. But beyond the trend lies something more profound, a realization that silence isn't the opposite of communication but its evolution. After all, every great cycle of human history ends not with a shout but with a pause. Civilizations collapse, languages die, monuments crumble, and still the air remains waiting. Maybe that's why every sacred text begins with sound and ends in silence. The Bible fades into revelation. The Vedas dissolve into meditation. Even the universe, according to physicists, may end not in fire but in entropy, a slow, cosmic hush. The final word, it seems, was never meant to be spoken. And so we arrive where it all began. The quiet after creation, the lull between breaths. Silence, the oldest language we ever knew, the one we keep trying to escape, and the one that will, in the end, speak for us all.